the father of history, and of lies. Cicero called him the father of history. Plutarch called him the father of lies. Both titles stuck, and both are accurate in ways that illuminate what Herodotus actually was, the first person in the Western tradition to write a sustained, systematic prose account of events in the human past, and also a man who included in that account stories about giant ants that mine gold, one-eyed men who steal griffins' eggs, and a river in Arabia that flows with cassia. He presented all of these with essentially the same tone, the tone of a careful, inquiring man who had been told these things by people he considered reliable, and who felt it was his job to report what he had heard rather than to decide in advance what was true. This combination, rigorous inquiry alongside willingness to include the unverifiable, is not a contradiction. It is Herodotus's method, and understanding it is the key to understanding both why he is considered the founder of historical writing and why he has been accused of credulity for 2,500 years. He was working in a world where the distinction between history and myth, between what could be verified and what could only be transmitted, had not yet been drawn clearly. He was the person drawing it, imperfectly, for the first time. Halicarnassus, the city that made him a traveler. Herodotus was born around 484 BC in Halicarnassus, a Greek city on the southwestern coast of Asia Minor, modern Bodrum in Turkey. The city was significant. It was not a provincial backwater but a cosmopolitan port at the meeting point of Greek and Persian cultures, the kind of place where a curious child could grow up understanding that the world contained more than one way of doing things and more than one way of understanding them. The political circumstances of his youth were turbulent. Halicarnassus was governed by a line of dynasts under Persian suzerainty, the most famous of whom was Artemisia I, who had commanded Halicarnassian ships at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC and whom Herodotus treats in his histories with a mixture of admiration and irony. She is simultaneously the most tactically shrewd commander at Salamis and the only one whose advice Xerxes consistently ignores. Herodotus grew up in a city where Persian authority was real and immediate, Greek identity was a cultural inheritance rather than a political fact, and the interaction between the two was the organizing principle of daily life. At some point, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, Herodotus left Halicarnassus, possibly expelled during political troubles, and began the traveling that would define his life. He traveled widely by the standards of any era. Egypt, where he went as far south as Elephantine at the first cataract of the Nile, Babylon, the Scythian steppes north of the Black Sea, the Levantine coast, mainland Greece, southern Italy. He talked to everyone, priests, merchants, soldiers, local guides, oracles, craftsmen, and he wrote down what he heard. The inquiry, what historia actually means. The word Herodotus uses to describe his project is historia, which in Greek does not mean history in our sense but inquiry, investigation, the systematic asking of questions. His opening sentence announces this: "This is the display of the inquiry of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, so that things done by men not be forgotten in time, and that great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some by barbarians, not lose their glory, and especially, the reason why they warred against each other." The project is simultaneously archival, preserving what would otherwise be lost, and causal. He wants to know why the Persian wars happened, not just that they happened. This double ambition, preservation and explanation, is what distinguishes his work from the chronicles and king lists that preceded it. Chronicles record that a king conquered a city in a given year. Herodotus asks why the king wanted to conquer it, what the city had done to provoke him, how the preceding generations had established the conditions that made the conflict possible, and what it felt like to be there. He quotes his sources directly, attributes claims to specific informants, and when accounts conflict he often presents both without resolving the contradiction. "I am obliged to report what is said," he writes at one point, "but I am not obliged to believe it." This is a methodological statement of considerable sophistication for its era, the distinction between testimony and truth, between what a source reports and what can be verified, is not always made even by writers much closer to our own time. Croesus, the king who misread an oracle. The first great story in the histories, and in many ways the key that unlocks everything that follows, is the story of Croesus, king of Lydia, the wealthiest man in the ancient world. His name has become a byword for wealth in every language that has inherited Greek culture. Rich as Croesus is still a living idiom in English, French, German, and a dozen other tongues, 2,500 years after the man himself lost everything. Croesus was, by every material measure, at the apex of human fortune. His kingdom controlled the river Pactolus, whose sands were literally golden. The myth of Midas's touch pointed at a real geological phenomenon, the electrum alluvium that made Lydian rivers a natural gold source. He had subdued most of the Greek cities on the Aegean coast. He had sent lavish dedications to the great sanctuaries of Greece, particularly to Delphi, where the gold and silver he gave were so extraordinary that the Delphians placed his name among their greatest benefactors. He asked Delphi which of the Greek philosophers was the wisest. The oracle told him. Solon of Athens. Croesus summoned Solon. He showed him his treasuries, his court, his accumulated glory, and then asked, "Who is the happiest man you have ever seen?" He expected to be named. Solon named a man called Tellus of Athens, who had lived a decent life, seen his children prosper, and died honorably in battle for his city. Croesus pressed him, surely then Croesus himself was second. Solon named two brothers from Argos who had died young after performing a great act of filial devotion. When Croesus demanded to know why he was not even mentioned, Solon said, "Because no man can be called happy until he is dead. Fortune changes. Count no man happy until his life is over." Croesus dismissed Solon as a fool. He could not have known that within years his son would be killed in an accident, his kingdom would be conquered by Cyrus of Persia, and he himself would be placed on a funeral pyre. Saved at the last moment, according to Herodotus, when he called out Solon's name, and Cyrus, curious, had him taken down and asked what he had said. Croesus told the story of Solon. Cyrus, understanding it as a warning that his own fortune might also reverse, befriended the man he had just conquered. The story ends not in tragedy but in a kind of bitter wisdom. Croesus lived, as an advisor to his conqueror, seeing Solon's words prove true at every turn. The oracle that sealed his fate was classic Delphic ambiguity. Croesus asked whether he should attack Cyrus's Persia. The oracle told him, "If you cross the Halys River, you will destroy a great empire." He crossed. He destroyed a great empire, his own. Herodotus does not moralize. He simply tells the story, and lets the pattern speak for itself. Egypt, the oldest story. The second book of the Histories is entirely devoted to Egypt. Its geography, its religion, its customs, its history going back to the earliest dynasties. It is the longest digression in the work, and it is also, paradoxically, the section most obviously shaped by the tension between what Herodotus was told and what he could verify. He had visited Egypt personally, had gone as far south as Elephantine, had talked to priests at Heliopolis and Memphis, and had seen monuments that were already ancient when Greece was young. What he found there challenged everything Greek culture assumed about the relationship between the ancient and the modern. Egypt was old in a way that Hellas was not, old in a way that made Greek history look like an episode in a much longer story. The priests at Heliopolis showed him records going back 341 generations of high priests, each generation approximately 30 years, a span of history that dwarfed anything the Greek tradition could offer. He measured the base of the Great Pyramid by pacing it out himself. He noticed, correctly, that the Nile Delta was built up from river sediment and that this process had been going on for a very long time, a geological observation that pointed toward deep time without having a conceptual framework to contain it. He also reported things that modern scholars have been unable to verify. The claim that Pharaoh Necho sent a Phoenician fleet to circumnavigate Africa, starting from the Red Sea and returning through the Pillars of Hercules, a 3-year voyage that Herodotus himself doubted, because the sailors reported that the sun was on their right when sailing west, which seemed impossible. Modern historians note that this is precisely what would happen in the southern hemisphere, and that Herodotus's doubt about the one detail that confirms the voyage's authenticity is one of the most tantalizing ironies in the history of knowledge. The Persian Wars, when the world held its breath. The central narrative of the histories, the event that the entire first half of the work has been building toward, is the Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BC. Xerxes, son of Darius, assembled the largest army the ancient world had ever seen, bridged the Hellespont with boats, and marched west to punish Greece for the defeat of his father's forces at Marathon 10 years earlier. The numbers Herodotus gives, 1.7 million fighting men, are almost certainly exaggerated, possibly by the Greeks who counted them, possibly by the tradition that transmitted the count to Herodotus. Modern estimates range from 200,000 to 300,000. Either number was overwhelming relative to what the Greek city-states could field. The Greek response was one of the most consequential military coalitions in history. Sparta and Athens, cities that had been rivals for a generation, agreed to cooperate under the pressure of existential threat. The result was the campaigns that defined Greek identity for centuries. The holding action at Thermopylae, where Leonidas and 300 Spartans held the mountain pass against the Persian advance long enough for the Greek fleet to evacuate Athens and regroup. The naval battle at Artemisium, fought simultaneously, the evacuation and burning of Athens, the decisive naval victory at Salamis, which Herodotus narrates with the precision and narrative intensity of an eyewitness, and the final land battle at Plataea in 479 BC, where the Persian army was destroyed. Herodotus was not at Thermopylae or Salamis, he was a child at the time of the battles, and he was gathering his information decades later from survivors, their children, and local traditions. But his account of Thermopylae in particular has the quality of myth already attached to it. He knows he is describing something that has already become a legend in the decades between the event and his writing. The 300 Spartans who died there had been transformed, within a generation, from a rearguard covering a retreat into the symbol of civilizational resistance, the idea that free men fighting for their own homes will outfight subjects fighting on command. Herodotus understood this transformation was happening, and he both participated in it and, through his questions about what exactly happened and why, gently complicated it. The Battle of Thermopylae. 3 days that changed everything. The strategic situation at Thermopylae in August 480 BC was, on its face, hopeless. The pass was narrow, perhaps 15 meters wide at its narrowest point, which negated the Persian numerical advantage, but Xerxes had only to find a way around it, and a local man named Ephialtes showed him one, a mountain path that emerged behind the Greek position. The moment Leonidas learned of the betrayal, he dismissed most of the allied forces, keeping only the Spartans, 300 Thespians who refused to leave, and several hundred Thebans, some of whom, Herodotus notes with careful specificity, were there unwillingly. The final stand that followed was, militarily, a rearguard action. Its purpose was to allow the Allied fleet and the population of Athens time to evacuate. In that limited sense it succeeded. It held the pass for 2 days and part of a third before the Persian flanking force arrived. But what Herodotus captures, through the stories he collected from survivors and the inscriptions he read on the burial monuments, is the texture of those final hours. The Spartans combing their hair before battle, the men fighting with broken spears and then with bare hands when the spears were gone, the bodies of the Persian dead stacked so deep that Xerxes had to conceal most of them before he would let his own troops see the field. He also preserves the exchanges that became legendary, a Persian emissary telling the Spartans that Xerxes' arrows would blot out the sun, and a Spartan replying that they would fight in the shade. Leonidas being asked why he had brought so few men, and answering that it was many for men who meant to die. Whether these exchanges happened exactly as reported, or whether they accumulated their sharpness in the retelling, Herodotus is doing something that he does throughout the histories, preserving not just what happened but what the people to whom it happened believed about it, which is often a different and equally important kind of truth. His method, between myth and evidence. The question of what to make of Herodotus as a historical source has been argued since antiquity. Thucydides, his younger contemporary, implied without naming him that previous historical writing had prioritized pleasurable storytelling over rigorous evidence, a criticism that is clearly aimed at Herodotus, and that has shaped his reputation ever since. Thucydides was more rigorous about evidence, more skeptical about divine causation, more focused on political and military analysis. He is, in many respects, a better historian in the modern sense. He is also a much less interesting writer. What Herodotus understood, and Thucydides largely set aside, is that the texture of a civilization, its beliefs, its myths, its self-understanding, is historical data, not noise to be filtered out. When an Egyptian priest tells Herodotus that their ancestors built a labyrinth of 3,000 rooms, the claim may not be literally true. But the fact that this is what Egyptian priests told inquiring foreigners in the 5th century BC tells you something real about Egyptian cultural self-presentation that no list of verified facts would capture. Herodotus was collecting testimony about how people understood their own worlds, not just verifiable facts about what happened. Modern archaeology has repeatedly vindicated Herodotus in cases where he seemed most implausible. The Scythian burial practices he described in elaborate detail, the shaft graves, the sacrificed horses and servants, the elaborate grave goods, were considered fantasy until 19th and 20th century excavations of Scythian kurgans confirmed them in remarkable detail. The circumnavigation of Africa by Phoenician sailors, which he doubted, has been reconsidered in light of his own evidence. The claim that Babylon's outer walls were wide enough for a 4-horse chariot to turn on top of them was dismissed as absurd until excavations revealed walls of precisely that width. He had been there. He had described what he saw. The Legacy, the first book about the world. The Histories is, among other things, the first extended prose work in the European tradition that treats the entire known world as its subject. Not just Greece, not just one city or one dynasty, but Egypt and Persia and Lydia and Scythia and Arabia and India, all brought together into a single narrative organized by the question of how the confrontation between Greece and Persia came to happen. In this sense it is not just the founding text of Western historiography but of a certain kind of cosmopolitan curiosity. The conviction that other cultures are worth understanding on their own terms, that the people across the border are not simply enemies or barbarians but human beings with their own histories and their own reasons for what they do. This conviction was not universal in the ancient world. Thucydides was interested in Greek affairs and largely indifferent to the inner workings of non-Greek societies. The Romans who conquered the Mediterranean wrote histories of their own power, not of the peoples they absorbed. Herodotus is unusual in his genuine interest in difference, in the fact that Egyptians knead dough with their feet and clay with their hands, that Scythians drink from the skulls of their enemies but also have elaborate funeral rites, that Persians consider it good manners to deliberate important questions twice, once drunk and once sober, to see if the decision holds under both conditions. He records these things not as evidence of barbarism but as evidence of variety, the astonishing, inexhaustible variety of ways human beings have found to organize their lives. Cicero called him the father of history. The title has stuck because it is accurate. Everything that came after him, Thucydides, Polybius, Tacitus, Gibbon, all the way to the academic discipline of history as it exists today, descends from his decision to make the human past the object of systematic prose inquiry. But Plutarch's counter-title, Father of Lies, has also stuck, and perhaps that is accurate too, in a way that is not entirely critical. Herodotus told stories. He told them because he believed that the past, in all its strange and various detail, was worth preserving, that the great and marvelous deeds of men, Greek and barbarian alike, should not be forgotten. 3,000 years later, they have not been.